Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about Robert Adams' conception of idolatry, why not all devotion to good things is itself good. So let us begin. So obviously devotion as a motive, like a devotion as a motive you have towards doing something, it can be bad. It can be bad by the object of your devotion being bad, right? If you're racist, the object of devotion is the humiliation of others. Well, that's obviously bad. If you're, if the object of your devotion is, to, self-centered satisfaction and things like that, I mean, they can be bad. The object can be hurting others and so on, right? So obviously, when the object of your devotion, the thing you're trying to strive for is bad, your devotion to it is going to be bad. Um, but the weird thing happens when the object is good, right? There's this good thing in the world, valuable thing, and you are committed to it. And yet, even in that case, it can go wrong. So here's what Adam says: It is possible to care to excess even about things that it is good to care about. So it goes wrong. The devotion goes wrong typically when it is excessive. It can also be not strong enough. That's a different way of your devotion to go wrong. But it's typically the excess part that is the more kind of pervasive way of distorting the otherwise good devotion to something that is good. Um, so here's a good example. It is good to love your work, right? Especially when that work is, constructive and you do it well, and there's a sense of self-satisfaction and fulfillment and joy that comes from it. That's wonderful. Love your work. That's great. Go for it. However, the consuming concentration on work of the so-called alcoholic is not a good thing, right? We call someone a workaholic when their work has taken over their life in a way in which it shouldn't have. It takes priority over other things in a way it shouldn't, right? It consumes their whole life to the detriment of, say, their family, their other commitments, their personal health, and so on. When it takes that kind of priority in their motivational kind of structure and by their behavior, something has gone wrong. Even though the work is great and the commitment to work, at least in general, is great, the workaholic has done something wrong. And Adam's just going to recruit the word idolatry to talk about the workaholic has made an idol out of work. But the word idolatry, I mean, etymologically, it goes back to idol, meaning image. Idolatry, the worship of images. So way back, like in the Old Testament, to accuse someone of idolatry is to accuse them of worshiping images or idols. That's the old etymology. As the theology got more sophisticated, we read the other definition that now Adams is going to incorporate, and he's going to extend. And the other conception, the more kind of Christian, 5th century onward conception of idolatry, is that of giving to anything finite a worship or devotion, um, or trust that belongs to God alone, right? It is treating something that is not God as though it were God. And typically that's the self, right? We treat ourselves as though we were God, right? That's the main kind of source of idolatry. But it doesn't have to be that, right? You can treat your family, you can treat your country, you can treat your career, you can treat all sorts of things as though they were God in some sense that we'll explore a little bit later. But uh, one of the meanings of the word idolatry that Adams is going to work with is idolatry as having, regarding an object, worshiping, caring, being devoted to an object that is good, but to such an extreme that you treat it as though it were God, when of course it's not. Treat a non-God object as though it were God. That's a way of making an idol out of this object. And that's a way of distorting your devotion to a subject because it's not God. You should not love it as though it were God. So Adams is going to retain this meaning of the word idolatry, but he's going to expand it. It's not just by making one makes an idol out of something, not merely by treating it as a word God, but rather along the lines of the workaholic. And so here's how he puts it: love of any finite object, that is, any non-God thing, love of any finite object, or realm of objects, collection of objects like family, friends, nation, is idolatrous if it is so exclusive that it keeps us from caring about other instances or types of goods. So your devotion, your commitment to your love towards some finite, legitimate good like your spouse becomes idolatrous when that love makes it such that you stop caring in principle about other things that are good, other instances of good like other people. A social group, for instance, is an idol for those who care about people only if they belong to it. So now racism. Racism can be the nasty, I just hate people that are not like me. And that's obviously very wrong that the object of devotion is bad, namely the hate towards others. But it can be a slightly better, though still pretty bad, slightly better. I care about, my group and I'm devoted to their well-being. And so far so good. But then it becomes idolatrous, I care for the group when it says I care for my group only, or perhaps even my group first in some distorted sense of first. So patriotism is great. Love your country is wonderful. However, when it means don't like it means abusing others, violating the rights of others that are not members of my country, it has transitioned into idolatry. Why? Because that dedication to a good that is a legitimate good has distorted, has been exaggerated to the exclusion of other legitimate goods. Once you make that transition, now it's become idolatrous, and that's the transition from caring about a group to being a racist, right? This is a serious transition. So the whole story in this chapter is grounded on what Adams calls the universality of love for the good. And this goes back to his previous chapter on devotion. And here's kind of a main thesis that emerges from the previous chapter. If you truly love something good, anything good, there must be this disposition, this unifying disposition of universal love for everything that is good. Otherwise, you don't actually love the thing that you say you do. So here's a good way of putting it concisely. A human person who loves the good should be, in principle, for what is good in every context. If I love my wife, if I truly love my wife, that means that I recognize and appreciate that which is good within her, her good traits, her good actions, and so on. And if I do that, if I appreciate and love the good things in my wife, I should, in principle, appreciate them in any context. One of the things I love about my wife is that she dances very well. If I really love my wife, love the way she dances, but that means if I love her well, that when I look at other people dancing well, I recognize, I don't distort to say, no, my wife is better than that when it's not, right? Part of the authenticity of love is this kind of detachment of like, this lack of obsession with regards to the goodness of your object of love. I recognize when other dancers are better than my wife, and I appreciate and enjoy that. Like, wow, that's even better. Great. Um, to truly love my wife is to appreciate what is lovable, what is good within her. One of the things is the dancing. And if I'm loving her well, that means I appreciate it elsewhere, at least in principle, right? I have to actually seek out other people to see that they dance well. But when I come across it, I should recognize, oh, that's dancing, that's great. That's even better than my wife, but it's not as good and so on. But legitimate love of something finite like dancing or a person like my wife includes this openness towards everything else that is good. Otherwise, it distorts the very love that I have for my wife and makes it into an idol. Only God Himself or goodness itself is the appropriate object of unconditional devotion or unconditional commitment. Everything else is finite, is limited, is not as good as God, and therefore our love should be appropriate to the goodness of the things that we love. Going back to the universality thesis, there are different ways of violating the universality thesis and therefore making an idol out of an object. And here's another instance. If I do not deplore injustice, whatever it occurs in the world, I do not truly love justice in my backyard, right? If I see an act of injustice in my country and I say, "Oh, I oppose this," and I try to do something about it, and someone points out, "Hey, did you know that across the border in the north is the same thing as happening too?" And I say, "I don't care. I guess that's not my country." That added to the "I don't care, it's not my country" is a violation of universality of thesis of love. It's an illustration, claims Adams, that I don't actually love justice here. Uh, Chances are I'm just being selfish and I don't like the injustice because it's too close to me and I don't want me to be in trouble, right? It's not really love, it's selfishness or something like that. If I truly love justice, I deplore it in my backyard and I deplore it everywhere. Well, I guess it is injustice that I deplore, not that it's close to me. So I may not have all of the resources to go and fix the world. Of course, I don't. But if I hear of injustice across the border, my natural response would be like, "Oh, that's so bad." Like I recognize the badness there, recognize the goodness of justice wherever it may be. So it's an attitude and principle of recognizing what is good. And unless I have that attitude, I don't truly love justice in my backyard. Something else that I drive me like self protection, selfishness. If some finite and partial good is the only good I am for, or the only good I care, and it's finite, right? It's not God, it's just a partial thing. Surely I have made an idol out of it, and thus I don't truly love it. So a story that was written by C.S. Lewis comes to mind of, this depiction of hell. There's this mother in hell, and she's holding on to her son, and she's not going to let the son go because she loves the son so much that she wants him to be with her. And of course, the way that is painted by C.S. Lewis, her love for the son began as a good thing, right? It's a love for something that is good, namely a son and a relationship with a son. But it got so distorted that she prefers to be in hell with him, to keep him in hell with her, in order to manifest her distorted conception of love, namely a kind of union with the son. And that's one of the extreme cases. But the conclusion is obvious. She loves the son so much that she doesn't really love him, right? Like the love has been so distorted, so excessive that it's no longer love. A more kind of relatable example is just a mother who refuses to let the son go into the world. He shields him so much from the world that when they finally leave, they don't know how to navigate the world because they've been so shielded, so protected that they don't understand anything. Or even worse, the mother does not let them to go to college and things like that, and like they just want to protect them. That's not good for the children. And if it's not good for the children, it's a distorted conception of love. It's an excessive kind of obsession with a good object that distorts the very love itself. So it's a way of violating the universality thesis of love, and it's a way of turning the otherwise good love into something bad, an idol, an excessive thing. So, okay, there's the example. Another example is the good professor that cares about students' learning. Good professors do that; they should do that. However, if it comes at the expense of, say, things like family commitments, then the devotion to the students themselves is distorted. Well, I guess it should have its proper role within the system of values that integrates all of the relevant commitments. And if it doesn't do that, it makes an idol of an otherwise very good thing, like caring for the learning of the students. But anyway, those are the examples. You can see it. Make an idol out of something when you violate the universality thesis for love of the good. A good example of this is Gauguin. He's an actual historical character. He was a painter. He was married, had young children. He was the source of financial support of the family. So he had two different values, right? Love for family and love for his art, for his paint. But they push in different directions. Love for his art commended that he went to the big city to study, to spend more time to practice, to develop his painting skills. There's actually a painting by him. The other love was the love for his family. He said, no, stay home, take care of us, that you get a lot of time to support us, to, build relationships with us, prepare us to go into the world and so on. So they were pushed in different directions. Different actions were called by the love of art and by the love of the family. The actual historical character left the family, abandoned his obligations as the financial source of support, and went onto the big city to paint. Um, Adams uses this example, Gauguin, as a way of illustrating idolatry. Adams points out that we don't actually know enough of the details to know whether it was idolatry, how bad an idolatry it was. So Adams just gives us Gauguin-like examples, so purely hypothetical cases that are similar to, that are inspired by the Gauguin example. And then we derive appropriate implications or morals about idolatry and how to understand idolatry. So the first one is Gauguin A. So again, a purely hypothetical case, loosely based on the actual historical painter. So let us suppose that Gauguin A, hypothetical case again, manages to pursue his art while remaining with his family, right? He thinks I should not violate my obligation to my family, commitment to duty to my family comes first, commitment to my art is second, and I'll try to work in as much commitment to my art as I can, given the bounds of staying with my family, my main duty. Um, Let us further suppose that he sometimes puts down his art to be with friends and to fulfill family obligations, right? So he cares a lot about art. It plays a big role in his life, but typically not by violating other moral duties that he has. However, it's not perfect, right? There is this observation that Adam makes. As art demands, however, he jealously guards a very large share of his time and energy for painting. And sometimes, perhaps even fairly often, this is a regular occurring pattern. He goes on painting when he knows his mode of duty to attend something else instead. his first, his firstborn that I suppose has his first main game, like in soccer game or something, and it will be great if he's there. It would be a great source of support. It would be participation in this important event, but he stays on painting anyway. And he does this occasionally, right? There's this pattern of giving preference to his time for painting at the expense of other things that are clearly more important. Um, Here's what Adams thinks. Obviously, on those occasions, he does wrong, right? When he gives an extra 2 hours worth of painting priority over going to see his son's first game, he's not thinking correctly. He's making the wrong thing. He shouldn't give so much weight to the 2 hours of painting. So on those occasions, he goes wrong, right? He does the wrong thing. That's like good for his character. What should we make of his commitment, his devotion to art, though? Is it idolatrous or not? Adams thinks not really. Idolatry is stronger than merely sometimes doing something wrong. I mean, we do that all the time, so we'll be idolatrous. Everyone will be idolatrous. Idolatry, as a category, will lose a lot of its meaning if in any time there's something wrong, it would count as idolatry. So that's too weak. So Adams thinks that Gauguin A is not idolatrous in that his passion for art, his devotion to art, is by and large admirable, wholly admirable, perhaps. Though the times in which he does the wrong thing, that's not right. Like it's not. We're not justifying the cases in which he gives priority to painting over taking care of his children. Those cases, he does something wrong. However, his devotion to art in general, it's a good thing. There's no idolatry here. He just a human being that sometimes does the wrong thing. So let's go Guinea. Uh, Gauguin B, again, another purely hypothetical example, based on loosely based on the historical Gauguin. And here's another painting by the historical Gauguin. Let us suppose that Gauguin B leaves his family to paint. He goes to Tahiti, that's the main city, and he becomes a great painter, like the original, like the historical Gauguin. Um, Let us further suppose that his passion for art was so irresistible that he was unable, in some strong sense of unable, to stand against the temptation to desert his family. In other words, when Gauguin B was thinking about staying with his family or going to paint, the drive, the desire for painting was so overwhelming that it was almost psychologically impossible for him to stay and fulfill his moral duties. He was just so moved by the passions to do that, and he did. Um, so his passion was an obsession. It was so overwhelming that it was almost impossible for him to have done differently. So here's what Adams thinks. Assuming that this passion is not pathological, that is ultimately beyond his control, it might be the results of a lot of decisions throughout his life that let him, be out of control over his own decisions and so on. But assuming it's not pathological, uh, Gauguin B is a case of idolatry, right? He's the case of a passion that is driving, and the passion is just doing away with the proper deliberation and identification of other duties, and is doing away with the behavior for other things, right? This person is failing to develop loving relationships, having friendships, and other things that are valuable for the sake of this consuming passion for art. So his consuming passion for art is idolatrous, claims Adams. So it's a case of distorted commitment or devotion to something legitimately good, namely art and painting. Third case, Gauguin C. Um, so Gauguin C is not obsessed as Gauguin B, right? It's not this huge emotional commitment, the drive that makes it hard to think about anything else. He's just like moved by the passions. Gauguin C is very different. He's calm. He's reasonable. He uses, he thinks. Uh, he has coolly resolved to let nothing stand in his way of his art. He just made a commitment, a free, unconstrained by the passions commitment to give his painting the center a piece of his life. Nothing is going to get in the way. So he did abandon his family because it got in the way of his painting. He never goes attends to any duty or human need or friendship at any cost of his painting. He only does any of these things when he's not painting, when he has the extra time, right? All of it is consciously, deliberately, all of his time dedicated to painting. And then he just works around it, some other things. Here's what Adams says. Such a resolution is a paradigmatic example of evil and ugly idolatry, and it is not admirable at all. Gauguin B, with the deep passions driving him, it's a little bit of blurrier line. C is the paradigmatic example of ugly idolatry. This devotion to his painting is pretty bad. Should not be admired at all. Maybe the painting should be admired, but not the devotion. So I'm going to skip a few. I'm going to go to Gauguin F. Gauguin F is also a very cool instance of a kind of idolatry. So this Gauguin recognizes his duty towards his family and recognizes that that is a more valuable duty, more important duty than his duty to his commitment toward his art. So he does not go to Tahiti. He does not go to the big city. He does not try to dedicate his life to paint. Uh, However, this Gauguinev laments having done that. He feels bad with himself. His love of art still burns passionately within him as ever. Even after many years, he's still miserable over his sacrifice. He's very unhappy with the fact that his duty pushed him away from, prevented him from pursuing his individual dream of becoming a painter. He cannot enjoy life with his family. He sees them and kind of blames them. I'm like, because of you, I abandoned. He's full of resentment towards them. He recognizes that it was his duty, so he complied with it. He's complied with his duty, but he cannot live with it. He has all of these nasty feelings towards his decision, and even worse, his family, because they were the ones that granted the obligation to stay with him. Um, Here's what Adam says. This is idolatry. And this is a special kind of idolatry. Why? Because the object of idolatry is art and painting. And Gauguinev abandoned that. He did not pursue his dream of painting. He complied with his moral obligations. He did the right thing. And yet, in the wrong way. He is still kind of committed to. He's endorsing this devotion to art. So here's the way I put it. He gives up on the object of idolatry, or the object he has made an idol out of, his idolatrous object, but not the idolatry itself. He gave up on painting, but not on his devotion, idolatrous devotion to painting. His devotion, even though he doesn't actually act upon the basis of it, is still so distorted that is making him incapable of appreciating the other goods that are there, namely his family, other valuable things he has. That's also an ugly idolatry that is consuming him. But it's a weird one because he did do the right thing, just an internal kind of thing. And this is a kind of a type of idolatry that is more pervasive, that appears other places, and you might not recognize unless you develop the concept. Um, so here's what Adam says. These are cases of excessive or inappropriate need for a finite object. There's this need, the attachment to a finite object, that gives rise to this uh, um, that kind of idolatry. This sort of idolatry is found not in loving another human being very much. That's great. Love people very much. Not in feeling the life, but in feeling the life is meaningless without that person. Not in the most intense enjoyments of philosophy. Philosophy is great, go for it. But in feeling that one would not be oneself if one could not do philosophy, have a career in philosophy, or any other career. It's not in the liking of other people, wanting to be their friend. Yeah, I like people, want to be their friends, but in feeling that one is worthless, or would be worthless if one were rejected by people. So care for it. Be committed to being liked, other people liking you. Be committed to a career. That's great. Be committed to a particular person, love them. That's great. But when it becomes distorted, is when it becomes a needy kind of thing. That's why we have the word needy. When you think you need them for your own happiness, that not having a which will make your life worthless. Uh, and that's a way of devaluating your own self. That kind of idolatry makes you think less of yourself. And Romeo and Juliet are paradigmatic kinds of cases of idolatry. Remember the story. They killed each other because they thought mistakenly, well, one of them mistakenly, correctly, but the other person was dead, right? So it was the belief that without you, I cannot live. Without you, my life is worthless. That created the chaos, that created them actually killing themselves. Had they not been idolatrous, had they just have, mourned and lamented the death of a beloved person, and went through that process, but realized that their life is, that they themselves have value, that they themselves, their life can be valuable even without this finite object, then ironically, nothing would have, I mean, if you go back to the story, ironically, the love would have continued on. And I guess there's no irony here. And Adams argues that that's exactly the point of the story. The point is that it was a distorted love that destroyed itself. Had it been a proper love that did not had this kind of extreme need, they would have been happy. And Adams thinks that that's exactly what Shakespeare is trying to argue. That Shakespeare does not present this as a great example of love, but a great example of God love gone wrong, becoming idolatrous. So the romantic spirit has seen in the suicide of Romeo and Juliet an embodiment of an idea of love. An admirable idolatry is not admirable immorality. If not an admirable immorality, uh, I do not admire it at all, says Adams. That's a distortion of what Shakespeare himself thought, and there's nothing to admire here. They are both idolatrous. That's why their life is tragic. Their idolatrous commitment to each other, devotion to each other, is what led to the uh, um, destruction of their love. So this gives rise to Gauguin F and Romeo and Juliet, rise to this kind of observation about the dynamics of love, need, and detachment. So here's some of the general observations. It's noteworthy that excessive need as a form of idolatry, as thinking that you need a particular finite object, otherwise your life is worthless. That's the need idolatry, Gauguin F, Romeo and Juliet. That one typically involves inability to value oneself appropriately. That kind of need of others to fulfill your happiness typically presupposes that you think that you yourself are not valuable. You don't value yourself enough. That's why you need something external to validate you. One feels that without the idol, one's life is not meaningless or would not be worth living. And that is false because there's just a finite object, right? The heart of that need in idolatry is this undervaluation of yourself, undervaluing of your own life. Love for the good, in contrast, on the other hand, carries with it a positive valuation of one's own life, so long as it contains possibilities of loving and pursuing other goods. And of course, one of those good is oneself, right? The loving Romeo would have committed suicide if Juliet had been dead. Why? Because he should love himself too. In a true love of Juliet would have this detachment, this separation of his need for her as a required for his life being worth living. So, in effect, there's this proposal of detachment. One must love all finite objects, but only to the extent that they're good, right? There's a kind of detachment that comes with all of the finite objects except God. God is the only infinite one. So love finite objects, but remember that they are finite. They will pass away, and treat them accordingly. Love them accordingly. Love them for themselves, but not as if they were God, because only God is God. Only God, the infinite good, deserves absolute devotion. If there's no God, nothing deserves absolute devotion. Well, goodness itself does, but goodness itself and God are the only objects worthy of absolute devotion. If you have that attitude towards a finite being, it is an idol for you. And here's the final observation. Religion, your ideas of God can themselves become an object, an idol, right? So one can this comes through misidentification of God. One's idea of God can also become an idol. You can start loving not God, but your idea of God. So this happens when one fails to distinguish devotion to God or the goodness as such, from devotion to one's own religion or one's own idea of God or the good. In other words, if you're truly committed to the good, you're not committed to your idea of the good. You're committed to things that are good and the way in which they manifest goodness. You're truly committed to God. It's not your idea of God, but like the real being in the real world that is God, not just your idea. So here's an example of idolatry and when it comes to God. It is at best morally ambiguous and can be downright evil to be explicitly devoted to a God whom one conceives as cruel and an arbitrary tyrant. If your conception of God is one in which God is cruel and a tyrant, and yet you're absolutely committed to this being, you have made an idol out of your idea of God. Why? Because that's not the perfect God, that it can only play the role of the object of absolute commitment. The only reason why God is distinct, he's the one that is the proper object of absolute commitment, is because he's absolutely good. If you have a conception of God that is not absolutely good, then that idea is not something that deserves appropriate absolute commitment. It's just like any other finite good. Here's the solution to, or the way of trying to avoid idolatry when it comes to your ideas of God, trying to distinguish God from your mere idea of God. Here's what Adam says. Theistic faith involves, or should involve, the consciousness of one's own fallibility and perfection. It's my idea of God that I'm working with here, and that should be reminded. I should be reminded of that. Uh, uh, this involves also a self-critical openness without rigidity and without defensiveness in relation to internal and external challenges to one's commitment. In other words, if I'm describing my idea of God to someone and they start providing objections to think, hey, wait a minute, that might be wrong because of this and so on, to have true faith, claims Adams, is to be open-minded, to listen, to question, to take seriously the possibility that your idea of God may be mistaken. Not that God is mistaken, but that your idea of God can be mistaken. And taking this challenge to your faith as a legitimate challenge that might lead to growth and development. If you reach a point in which you become narrow-minded or defensive or rigid or closed, you just defended your idea and your tradition. You have abandoned faith in God for faith in your tradition and your ideas. And that is a serious trap for the believer. Beware of that trap, says Robert Adams. So with that, I'll end. Bye.